I want to say thank you to all of you for coming here to WorldWays, our first program, and very happy to start this series coming out of international programs. I've recently started working there, and every day I'm surprised by the amazing people who work with international projects here at the University of Iowa, the contributors, the donors from the larger world, the business entrepreneurs who help people in international programs do projects all over the world. Very exciting place for me to be these days, and we're very happy to be here on this auspicious occasion, the 10th anniversary of the Center for Human Rights. So thank you all for coming, and welcome. As you know, we're here in the old Capitol building. We are being taped tonight by UITV, and we'll be showing this program on UITV in upcoming days, also airing the program on KRUI radio here at the University of Iowa. As you know, we have human rights as our focus tonight. In a little while, Michael Ratner and Burns Weston and others will be discussing international and local human rights issues from a variety of angles. We'll also be learning about the 1904 World's Fair and the Philippine Reservation, which housed 1,000 Filipinos for a year, serving as a living exhibit and a curiosity for the hundreds of thousands of fair visitors, and causing us to question what exactly they were thinking by creating this human zoo. And we'll share the life and the groundbreaking work of Dr. Ignacio Ponseti, recently deceased, and some of his orthopedics colleagues will be here to talk about the wonderful life and the wonderful work Dr. Ponseti was involved in here at the university and around the world. We do have one regret. We had hoped that former Governor Ray from Iowa, living now in Des Moines, would be here with us this evening, but he had to cancel last week due to some family obligations. We had hoped he would talk with us about what inspired him to make Iowa the lead state back in 1975 in creating a Bureau of Refugee Affairs that helped to resettle Southeast Asian refugees who were living in desperate circumstances. And we hope to have him with us on another occasion, but unfortunately not tonight. Now, here with me on stage is a friend of mine for many, many years, a faculty member in the voice department, music department here at the University of Iowa, Stephen Swanson, baritone. And at the piano is a colleague of his, another exceptional guy, David Gompper. Please give these two gentlemen a warm hand. So as I've mentioned, Stephen is a baritone and a voice professor here. David Gompper is not only a pianist, as he will be tonight for us, but he also heads the Center for New Music at the University of Iowa, and he's a composer. And he's a bit embarrassed that I'm going to say this, but he has recently received a very prestigious award, and it deserves mention tonight. This year, he was named one of the 2009 Music Award winners from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And this very prestigious award honors outstanding artistic achievement and acknowledges the composer who has arrived at his own voice. So we offer him our congratulations. So, embracing the theme of the evening, we decided we, of course, wanted to have music. I always want to have music in these programs. Music relates to everything we do in our lives and certainly to human rights. And so I decided to invite Stephen and David to share some of the songs they recently put together on a compact disc called Was My Brother in the Battle? Songs of War, to share some of those songs with us tonight. And I'm going to go to Stephen to ask him to explain a little bit about the songs that they are going to sing and why they put this record together in the first place.
Sure. The Song of War project started in 2004, and it came as a direct reaction to the publicity and build-up to Operation Iraqi Freedom. I was tremendously disturbed by what appeared to me the trivializing of calling our military forces to war. The idea that suddenly we could shock and awe an entire nation into a 6-month-long war that would cost us $20 billion, and then we'd be in and out and it would be done, seemed to me just unrealistic. And added to that, I had recently discussed with my sister-in-law, her husband, who had recently died, and he was a nose gunner in World War II, flying bombing raids from England to Germany. He came back apparently with no physical damage. He became a very successful businessman. What nobody knew was that for his entire life after his service in World War II, then not a single week went by when he didn't wake up either sobbing or screaming. And it seemed to me that as we were preparing to go into this adventure in Iraq, that those people who were saying this is something serious, this is something that changes both the nation that declares war and the nation that is warred upon, it changes the young men and women who are called on to serve. These voices were shouted down. And the professional military voices that said, this is more complicated than you're saying it is, were also shouted down. And so I thought, well, you can go into music and at least present another side of warfare. And so what we ended up with was a historical survey of war, starting with the Civil War, then World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War. And what we're going to sing for you today are two songs from the Vietnam period, and then one song that is composed by David, but is actually a text from the Civil War. And I think I'll talk about each one individually and then do some singing. The first one we're going to do is written by Eric Bogle. Eric Bogle is an Australian, and this was actually a Vietnam era song, but is about one of the great military disasters of World War I. The action by the Australian and New Zealand troops in Gallipoli, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. This was considered to be one of the fantastic military blunders in all warfare history, where they landed these people on a small, narrow beach, and above them were heavily dug-in machine guns and artillery, and the Australians were just plain slaughtered. It was just a hideous, hideous error. And Eric Bogle chose this particular song to reflect upon Australia's involvement in the war in Vietnam. So I'll sing that if you don't mind.
Please.
Amidst all the tears, the flag waving and cheers, we sailed off to Gallipoli. How well I remember that terrible day, how our blood stained the sand and the water, and how in that hell that they call Suvla Bay, we were butchered like lambs to the slaughter. Johnny Turkey was waiting, he'd primed himself well. He hailed us with bullets, he showered us with shells, and in 10 minutes flat, he'd blown us all to hell. Nearly blew us back home to Australia. And the band played Waltzing Matilda as we stopped to bury the slain. We buried ours, and the Turks buried theirs. Then it started all over again. And for nearly 10 weeks I kept myself alive in a mad world of death, blood, and fire. And for nearly 10 weeks I tried to survive, while around me the corpses piled higher. Then a great Turkish shell blew me arse overhead, and when I woke up in my hospital bed, I saw what it had done, and I wished I was dead. Never knew there were worse things than dying. For I'd go no more waltzing Matilda, all around the wild bush far and free. To hump tent and pegs, a man needs both legs. No more waltzing Matilda for me. Then they loaded the wounded, the sick and the maimed, and they sent us back home to Australia. The armless, the legless, the blind, the insane, all the brave wounded heroes of Suvla. And when our ship pulled into Circular Quay, I looked at the stumps where my legs used to be, and thanked Christ there was nobody waiting for me to grieve, to mourn, and to pity. And the band played Waltzing Matilda as they carried us down the gangway. But nobody cheered, they just stood there and stared, and they turned their faces away. And so every April my old comrades march, reliving old dreams and past glory. And I push my wheelchair out onto the porch, and I watch the parade pass before me. The old men walk slowly, old bones stiff and sore, tired old men from a forgotten war. And the young people ask, what are they marching for? I ask myself the same question. But the band played Waltzing Matilda, and the old men respond to the call. And as year follows year, more old men disappear. Someday no one will march there at all. And their ghosts can be heard as they walk round the billabong. You'll come a-waltzing Matilda with me.
Thank you, Stephen Swanson and David Gompper. Yeah, what a moving song.
The second song actually came, or the choice of the text for the second song came as a direct reaction to my anger at Donald Rumsfeld. And that anger stemmed out of news that I heard that he was using an electronic signature for signing the documents pertaining to the death of our soldiers. And I can't tell you how angry that made me. So I looked for a text that would show what a person who really took responsibility for his actions in war would do. And we settled on a letter of condolence that Abraham Lincoln wrote to a woman named Mrs. Bixby, who lost 5 of her sons in one battle in the Civil War. And David set this text. It's called Mrs. Bixby's Sons, and it is straight out, it's just the letter. So this is Mrs. Bixby's Sons, and, well, here we go.
Executive Mansion, Washington, November 21st, 1864. This is Bixby, Boston, Massachusetts. Dear Madam, I have been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously on the field of battle. Of mine, which should attempt to beguile you of the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering to you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost, and the solemn pride that must be yours to have lain so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Yours very sincerely, Abraham. Lincoln. Abraham.
And the last song we're going to do is Bob Dylan's Masters of War, which reflects, of course, on the entire military-industrial complex that thrives on warfare. A quick comment on what David has done with, there were actually 3 of these would have been contemporary American folk songs that were set for this performance. He did what's actually in the great tradition of composers like Brahms. He took a melody and a set of text and then did very interesting things underneath it to turn what is basically a piece meant to be played with the guitar into a serious piece of art song literature. And I particularly love this one. So this is Masters of War by Bob Dylan, arranged by David Gompper.
Come, you masters of war, you that build all the guns, you that build the death planes, you that build the big bombs, you that hide behind walls, you that hide behind desks. I just want you to know I can see through your masks. You that never done nothing but build to destroy, you play with my world like it's your little toy. You put a gun in my hand and you hide from my eyes. Then you turn and run farther when the fast bullets fly. Like Judas of old, you lie and deceive. A world war can be won, you want me to believe. Well, I see through your eyes, and I see through your brain, like I see through the water that runs down my drain. You fasten the triggers for others to fire, then you sit back and watch while the death count gets higher. You hide in your mansions while the young people's blood flows out of their bodies and is buried in the mud. How much do I know to talk out of turn? You might say that I'm young, you might say I'm unlearned, but there's one thing I know, though I'm younger than you, even Jesus could never forgive what you do. Let me ask you one question. Is your money that good? Will it buy you forgiveness? Do you think that it could? I think you will find when your death takes its toll, all the money you've made will never buy back your soul.
Thank you very much. That was a performance by David Gompper at the piano and Stephen Swanson, the baritone. Thank you so much. You're listening to World Ways, a new program from International Programs. We're happy to be here with you tonight. I'm Joan Kjaer. And International Programs' new initiative, World Reach, showcases the fascinating University of Iowa faculty, students, guests, artists, and speakers involved in international teaching and learning for local, national, and international audiences. And World Reach also supports and promotes many live events in the community, including educational programming for K-12 students, teachers, and events such as International Education Week, which is next week. For more information on these events and how you can support World Reach and international programs, please visit international.uiowa.edu. And I'm now motioning to Michael Ratner and Burns Weston to please come up to the stage, because we're ready now to introduce this very interesting duo of lawyers to you. And they're going to talk about international human rights. And once they get settled, please give them a welcome. Well, thank you so much. Those of you who've been with us all evening know a little bit about Michael Ratner, and you certainly know that he's received this year's Courage of Conviction Award from the University of Iowa Center for Human Rights. Pleasure for us to be in the same room with you.
Good to be with you, Joan.
Thank you. And Burns Weston is well known to most of us in Iowa and certainly at the University of Iowa. Long career, now an emeritus professor here at the University of Iowa Law School, and he began the Center for Human Rights many years ago. And even though you say you've retired, I don't think you actually have. You still spend a lot of time there. Yeah, so very good to have you both here with us. And I'd like to start with you, Michael, if I may. You've been spending some time today talking to students, young lawyers on their way up, other people who are interested in human rights. And I'd like to start with a sort of very basic personal question. What is it that inspired you to go down this road in your own life?
Well, I remember, I don't know if everybody remembers when Jean Genet got caught stealing a loaf of bread and then became a criminal the rest of his life, or something like that. Well, I didn't get caught, I got wrongfully caught breaking erasers in half at some F.W. Woolworth store in Cleveland, but I didn't really break them, but the clerk said she saw me break them, a total lie, and she said I had to pay for them. And I was 12 years old, and I went and dutifully paid for them rather than have them call the police, although I'd done nothing. So that's the beginning, and the end. So I never trusted anybody after that, particularly officials. So that was the start, and the end was I was at Columbia in 1968. It's a nice middle-class lawyer going to law school. And all of a sudden, I decided to take a year off. I was liberal, so I was working at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And I came back, and my fellow students had taken over all the buildings at Columbia. And I came back the night when 1,000 cops were sent on the campus and beat the heck out of all of us standing there. There was blood everywhere. And I actually never turned back after that. I then decided that that's my life, is human rights and civil rights.
Yeah. Well, as we all have heard, and as we can imagine, most of the cases that your center and that you have gotten involved in are pretty tough cases, very often public opinion largely against you. I mean, that has to sometimes feel, maybe it energizes you a little bit, but you have to also sometimes wonder, how can we make our case, and how can we convince people that we are on the right side of this issue? It must keep you up at night.
Well, it's a good question, and I don't think we often convince a lot of the population that we're on the right side, and Guantanamo is a good example. I think we've created a movement of lawyers. There's 700 or so lawyers working with us from all walks of life, big firms, small firms, doing that. We've been successful on that. We've been successful on the editorial pages. But I think if you went across this country, they would say, well, you got a bunch of terrorists at Guantanamo, leave them there. At least a lot of people would say that. And the amount of hate mail we received when we started was extreme. There were 4 of us starting the cases. It took us 2 years until we won in the Supreme Court. Then we got lawyers. So it can be extremely lonely out there for long periods. There are worse periods, I think, we've had, or bad periods. The MacArthur period was obviously people were very isolated. But we had a surprise. In some ways, it's one of the best chapters of the American bar that I've seen, the way people came forward to put their lives on the line and really represent Guantanamo people.
Well, let's talk about some of these sort of more recent issues that I know you and your center are fighting hard on. The issue of torture, for example, use of torture by the military. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, the center has worked on issues of torture since our almost founding, whether torture in U.S. prisons or torture abroad. And we won a series of cases having to do with torturers who come into the United States from Paraguay, from Haiti, from Guatemala, from Bosnia. And we always won those cases, and American courts upheld the absolute prohibition on torture. And when it came to our own country involving itself in torture that was open, notorious, and public, we've been much less successful. And the sad part for me is this is a prohibition that in our view is absolute. And the United States is the place that is the most powerful country in the world and should have stood for an absolute prohibition on torture. And now when we go and say to some small dictatorship, don't torture, they say to us, what are you talking about? And so in some way, it's what I use the word like renting. There was a fabric of human rights that was fairly solidly surrounding certain fundamental rights like the prohibition on torture. And the United States has torn it. And it can be sewn back together again in some way, but it'll never be as strong as it was originally. And that's extremely sad for me, and that it's my country that did that. And until I believe that there's accountability in this country for torture, whether you want a truth commission or whether you want an investigation of the Donald Rumsfelds of the world, there has to be accountability. And when President Obama says he's looking forward and not backward, it's very upsetting to me, because prosecutions and accountability are about looking forward to make sure that torture doesn't happen again. That's what criminal law is about. It's about deterrence. And so it's not good. It's not good when I work with human rights organizations around the world. They say that the dictator in our country, he just says, you guys did it, we can do it. So it's a serious moment, I think, that all of us felt about our work, and we're still working on accountability, but we don't seem to be moving quickly. On the other hand, it took 35 years to get General Pinochet in the dock in Chile. So we have a long memory here, and I'm convinced that at some point there'll be some form of accountability.
So I heard in your last comment the disappointment that you feel so far with the Obama administration. Do you think that within another year, another 2 years, there will be
it's very
greater
mixed.
alignment?
It's obviously very mixed. We're glad not to have someone who is just willing to shred the Constitution completely. I mean, there's a big difference. He signed executive orders on the second day of office, saying he would close Guantanamo, ending torture, ending secret sites. These are all very positive. Today, for example, he decided that he was going to try some of the alleged 9/11 conspirators in a federal court. We've wanted that all the time. We don't want some rump military trial for people. We want a court that's going to be respected so that the people of the world understand that this is a serious conviction. So he's mixed. On other issues, he wants to keep things we don't like, state secrecy, preventive detention. But it's certainly, it's a fight. It's a pitched battle in which not just us, but many human rights organizations and people are trying to push in one direction, and the national security establishment in this country is pushing in the other direction.
Right.
And so that's the contested area.
Right. Well, I don't want to steal the thunder of your keynote tomorrow, but it has a very interesting title. Do you remember what the title is?
Yes, it's something about the national security state from W to O. Something like that.
And I think it was something like, it didn't start with W, it
didn't
won't
start
end with O.
W, and it won't end with O. And that's just the long-term history of my own history and of the United States in the last period, that I feel like in some sense it's like President Obama is sitting on a whale. And he's trying, even if he was stronger and good-hearted and the best interests, how do you move a whale around? How do you move 1,000 military bases around? What do you do? And so it's partly his strength, and it's partly a national security establishment in this country, and essentially a world power, hegemonic power, that is very hard to shift. And much of what we suffer in terms of human rights and civil liberties is a result of that. And I think it's, I'll mention it tomorrow, but I think it's Thucydides' history of Athens. And he talks about how Athens' empire abroad eventually destroyed Athens' democracy at home. And that's, I fear that we're looking at that, and certainly Obama is a break from what we were going through. But it's a break that we really need to keep in mind and push hard on all the time.
Well, Burns, let me turn to you and talk to you a little bit about your current work in human rights and international law, and also the thinking behind the establishment of the center here at this university. It's my understanding from earlier conversations we've had that economic rights, social rights, group rights, these kinds of things tend to be the central area the center works on.
Well, when we founded the center, I think there was a collective decision that civil and political rights, being very much embedded in our own Bill of Rights, of our own Constitution, that there were many people around the country in academic centers and elsewhere, including the Center for Constitutional Rights, where the primary emphasis was on civil and political rights. And we thought, we don't want just to be another center. We want to be something that has its own distinctive mark. And so we actually did three things that were central. One was we made a conscious decision to focus primarily, but by no means exclusively, and I rest my case here with Michael as an example, on economic, social, and cultural rights, sometimes referred to as second-generation rights, and what sometimes people refer to as communitarian or group rights. I'm thinking about such things as the right to a clean and healthy environment, for example, or the right to economic development, or the right to peace, things that really involve major issues that face the planet, which no single state can possibly resolve on their own. It requires global cooperation. So that was one big decision we made. A second was a strong commitment to multidisciplinary work. This is why it was not, I might add, housed in the law school. The decision was to place it on that part of the campus, which would not be off on some corner of the campus, albeit I think the law school, of course, is the campus, but not off in some corner of the campus, but rather on that part of the campus where you would have immediate and strong contact with all the disciplines, including the hard sciences, and of course the humanities, the social sciences, and so forth. And a third component, actually, that derives out of that, dates back to my own personal history as a young person. I grew up really pretty much through the beginning years of my college. I was on my way, I thought at the time, to becoming a concert pianist, and so I had studied music a great deal and ended up at the Oberlin Conservatory of Music, and later switched out of that and went on into the college. And actually, it sort of goes back to Michael's question you asked Michael about what got him turned on to social justice issues, and it was one of the things, not the earliest, but one of the things that got me turned on to all this was that when I arrived on the campus in Oberlin, Ohio, when was that? In 1952, I guess, something like that. I had a friend of mine, an African American fellow, and I wanted to get a haircut. And we went downtown to the local barber, and they wouldn't cut his hair, and that just so enraged me. And so, again, from the rest is history. But the point was that I think one of the points of our creation of the center was to bridge the gap between the sort of the social science-y, legal ways of thinking about human rights and the more intuitive ways of thinking about human rights. That is to say, trying to connect as much as we could the right and the left side of the brain in the belief that it is really not possible, I don't think, to bring about serious progressive social change without the whole brain working, that we need to engage music and art and dance and all. Thank you for this wonderful music, Joan. I really had tears in my eyes from some of the things I was hearing. But that's the whole point, that you tap into the fundamental emotions we have, and that way you sort of connect with what you read in the textbook in a way that otherwise you just don't. And so it's that connection that we found to be very important. Now, you were asking me about my work. One of the I guess the most important thing I'm working on now, and I have been really for the last 3 years or so, and it's an example of how we are focusing not so much on civil and political rights, but on the economic, social, and communitarian or group rights nature of things. And that has to do with climate change. And when you stop and think about how serious climate change is, I'm sure everybody in this room believes climate change exists. I'm sure everybody in this room believes global warming exists. But I really seriously doubt that everybody realizes just how serious it is. It is a major planetary emergency we're facing. And so in that spirit, I thought to myself, what can I as a lawyer do? What can law do about this? Well, probably not very much. It takes many, many different skills and many, many different disciplines to cope with a major crisis of this sort. But we developed a program that we call the Climate Legacy Initiative, for which we got substantial outside funds, and we have produced in the last year, the last actually 6 months or so, the result of a 3-year study that we've called the Climate Legacy Initiative Policy Paper, the title of which basically tells you the story. It is recalibrating the law of humans with the laws of nature, subtitled Climate Change, Human Rights, and Intergenerational Justice. You have to be thinking about climate change and the environment and the degradation, the loss of biodiversity and all these things from the standpoint of what are we leaving to our children? What are we leaving to our grandchildren? And I hate to tell you, the story is pretty miserable, but we've got to act. And so that's where I've been working. One of the lead recommendations in that paper was the definition and development of what I'm calling the law of the ecological commons. And what I'm now doing is trying to develop another big project that will focus on just that. And the purpose will be, it'll be really essentially divided up into 3 parts. The first part of which I'm working on now, which is to lay the sort of the jurisprudential or legal philosophical foundations for the proposition that there is indeed a human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And that's important because human rights, or the very concept of right, as opposed to a standard or a goal, is a very compelling political as well as legal concept. And it sort of alters one's frame of reference and alters one's sense of urgency and commitment when you can talk the language of rights, as I'm sure Michael will support me on that, rather than when talking about standards, which can easily be changed and overridden. And so the particular project I'm right now working on is, again, a long title. I apologize for it. I have to figure out a way to shorten it. But it, again, sort of tells the story. What we're talking about here is something that we're calling reclaiming the ecological commons in order to operationalize the human right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment. What that means, there was a reference earlier, I'm not sure who made it. I think maybe it was President Mason in her comments on the award that was being given to Michael, a reference back to the Magna Carta. We're going back to the Magna Carta when King John was confronted by the commoners, not just in the Magna Carta, but also by another document that many people don't even know exists, including many lawyers don't know exists, called the Charter of the Forests, in which essentially the idea that commoners have a right to a clean environment, to an environment that sustains their life, and that the king can't take that away from them. And there is a great historian from the University of Toledo by the name of Peter Linebaugh, who I hope we can get here to campus in the next coming year, who has written a book called the Magna Carta Manifesto, which has had a powerful influence on my thinking on all this. And our idea is to try to trace the development of commons thinking, whether we're talking about the atmosphere or some local aquifer, whatever it might be, all the way global to local, how we can get that idea linked, as I think we can historically, to the development of human rights, that the two go hand in hand all the way from 1215 to the present day, and that they have been, you might say, as a colleague with whom I'm working has written a book by this title, there's been a silent theft of this by governments, by empires, and by large corporations of these things that really belong to us. And so the issue here is going to be to try to develop a theory that will allow us to reclaim that, rather than to think that we have to create it from scratch. So that's what I'm working on, and we're hoping very much that we can get the funding for it and go forward with another policy paper or something.
So, Michael, when you hear discussions of these kinds of rights, very conceptual, high-level stuff relating to the peoples of the world and not necessarily one person in one place who may have a claim against the former government of Yugoslavia or whatever, how does this relate to the work you do as a human rights lawyer?
We've been thinking about these issues a lot because fundamental issues of economic rights and social rights are very crucial, but they've been treated as sort of a stepchild in this country. And what's interesting about what Burns is saying is that that split goes all the way back. It wasn't a split then between the Magna Carta, which is what we in the sort of Western legal tradition, Anglo-English tradition, look at as our legacy, but we disregard what's called the Charter of the Forest, which is economic rights. And our country's founded on the theory that if we guarantee people process, if we guarantee them political rights, the country will be able to figure out by itself whether it wants to give people health care or feed people or protect the environment. And so the idea of bringing them together and looking at both sets of rights as rights is obviously crucial. As I said to Burns, one of the problems in this country is as people who go to court, courts don't recognize the second set of rights. They recognize the right to have a hearing before you get thrown in jail. They recognize those kind of rights, but they don't recognize the right necessarily to education or health care or housing or those kind of rights, or the right to a certain kind of environment. So it's important work that I think will be much more recognized going forward.
As we end our little segment here, I think very often of a question that gets asked in every single political campaign, I think, and it's one you'll all recognize. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Are we in the world of human rights better off than we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago? Are we just sort of holding our own?
Post-Second World War is when really I would say, Burns probably knows the history better than I, that the modern human rights world began with the United Nations, various treaties protecting us, and there's been a gradual increase in that. We have international courts now for various issues, from criminal courts to others, to special tribunals to try people. Yeah. We have treaties on women, on the environment, on children. So clearly from an relatively abstract point of view, there's a lot out there. The question is enforcement, and we went through a very dark period, at least in this country, supporting the enforcement of various kinds of rights over the last 8 years. We've gone through a dark period throughout in terms of economic rights and those kind of rights and supporting those, and particularly holding the U.S. accountable in international community for its violations. Other countries join various courts, they have various enforcements. U.S. doesn't do that. So I would say it's a good break after the last 8 years, and we're just on the road back to even an equilibrium. But we have a very long way to go, particularly on economic, social rights. And cultural. Those we have a long way to go.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with what Michael said. I guess I would add that, to be very frank, the record of the United States in the promotion and protection of human rights, of international human rights at least, has been a rather dismal one over the years, even from the very beginning. Even though the United States has been involved in the creation of the treaties and the many resolutions and so forth that build up the framework of international human rights law, except for some limited numbers of treaties, for example, the Convention on the Prohibition of Torture, or the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and so forth, except for a limited number, the United States has simply not signed on. This is very popular to say, but just to give you a quick example, there is something known as the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Every country that signed on to that, 195 countries, I think it is, signed on to that. Only 2 have not ratified it. One is a country called Somalia, which doesn't even have a government, okay? The other, I'll leave you to guess who it is. That's pretty pathetic. But what it represents, really, in large part, I believe, the reason the United States has resisted this is because it's still very much locked into a anti-communist, anti-socialist sort of mentality about anything that has anything to do with economic and social rights. And so that there's no willingness to sign, no willingness to ratify this particular convention, because in fact it addresses all those kinds of things for children. And if it's going to address it for children, the United States sees this as the opening a floodgate of socialism in this country. Well, and it's a little bit much to swallow, especially after what we've been hearing in the last several months of political rhetoric, if you call it that, over the health care debate. I think we are better off now, yes, than when the Spanish Inquisition was on. But you know what? I really do think that the dark days that Michael was talking about, and we're talking about essentially the 8 years of George W. Bush, but it's not only the years of George W. Bush. Even the years of Bill Clinton were a backslide. Bill Clinton could have, had he been smart enough to, he could have gotten the United States to have gotten on board with the International Criminal Court. He did not. He left it for the next administration. And the next administration not only didn't get on board, it withdrew its complete participation, which then allowed it to go all around, do all sorts of things to sabotage that convention. And that's what they did systematically all around the world. So I don't really think, there's no question that the Bush years were dark years for human rights, but it is not a partisan divide. It's something that has gone through both political parties. They have not been forthright. The only time the United States has shown, in my judgment, any real grit across the broad range of things that I call human rights was during the administration of Jimmy Carter, when for a very short, brief period, I'm talking about the Secretary of State's name at the time, I've forgotten.
Vance? Cyrus
Vance? Cyrus Vance, thank you. When Cyrus Vance was Secretary of State, and the United States officially endorsed the idea that human rights were more than what was found in the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution, and extended beyond to include all the rights that were enumerated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But that's after that, and when President Reagan came in, and the others, and Clinton, and right up to this day, the United States is just not on board with the rest of the world. And I think that's too bad.
President Franklin Roosevelt had a second Bill of Rights. Right before he died, he read on TV, if anybody's seen the Michael Moore capitalism film, he has Roosevelt reading it, and the second Bill of Rights is about really economic rights. And had he lived, who knows what would have happened, but he was certainly one of the major proponents of it at the end of the war.
Well, I can't say thank you enough to both of you for sharing your thoughts with us tonight. Please, everyone, thank Burns Weston, Michael Ratner.
Thank you. Thank you, Joan.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
You can go.
This This is World Ways. I'm Joan Kjaer. World Ways is a production of international programs at the University of Iowa, your global intersection connecting students, faculty, and Iowans with one another and the world. This program is coming to you from the Senate Chamber of the Old Capitol Museum and will be broadcast on UITV and KRUI. Broadcast schedules for World Ways can be found on the International Programs website, which is international.uiowa.edu. And joining me on stage now are three lovely young women who all work in the area of human rights. And the woman just next to me is Chivy Sock. Very good to see you again, Chivy.
Oh, it's great to be back.
Thank you. Amy Weissman, and you work here in Iowa City, and we'll be talking more about you later, but you certainly have an important role now with the Center for Human Rights as Deputy Director. And Kate Karachai, a graduate student here at the University of Iowa, a wonderful history of fight for civil rights and human rights here in Iowa and beyond. So again, please welcome these guests. So I'm going to begin with Chivy Sock. We met many years ago when she was working here at the University of Iowa and worked with Burns Weston setting up the Center for Human Rights. And you are also, I think, the project manager for the very large, more than $1 million grant on child labor research. And you now live in San Francisco or near San Francisco and continue to work on child labor issues.
And other human rights stuff that's been very important to me.
Yeah. So tell us what you're doing now and how you got involved in all of this.
Well, as I was listening to Burns and also now Michael, I want to just sort of backtrack a little bit because I was very moved. And at a very, very early stage in my life, when I was still a student, I was trying to figure out what is it that this world is all about? Where do I fit in all of this? And just to give you, I see so many familiar faces, old friends that I had worked with over the years when I was here in Iowa, and it's all very emotional for me to be back here. So hello to all of the wonderful friends. But all of you who worked with me know how passionate I am about human rights and social justice. I mean, it comes straight from here as well as here as well as here. And it's a combination of all of these three places that really drives my everyday thinking as well as what the future holds. So let me just backtrack a little bit and why this field has been so important to me and the millions of other people that are engaged in this kind of work. It comes from a very personal place. So all of the friends in the room know that I spent almost 4 years of my life in the Cambodian killing fields as a child laborer and as part of an entire population that was enslaved in the country of Cambodia when the Khmer Rouge took over. And so I know personally what it means to have the oxygen taken away from you, to have this label as a slave imposed upon you. I know what it's like to live without rights, to be completely controlled on a daily basis in terms of what you do when you wake up, in terms of the food intake that you have or not have, in terms of fashion. We were not allowed to wear anything else but black. And ironically, I'm all in black today. But this is a reclaiming of my fashion. To have the type of haircut. You can't have any other haircut for a woman except very short bobbed hair. To make a decision about marriage. Marriage was something that the state controlled because they wanted you to reproduce, for example. So to live without those most basic things that make you a human being, that makes life dignified, makes life worth living, the freedom to think, to articulate, to share, to bond, to organize. These are all of the very, very basic things that we need to live that dignified life, and I lived without it. And so when I came out of it, came to this country, rebuilt my life, found the concept of human rights through the writing of Burns Weston in the Encyclopedia Britannica, studied it in college, and I thought, you know, this is something that I want to devote my life to because I wanted to make it meaningful and at the same time so that other people wouldn't have to go through what I went through. So human rights to me comes from a very personal space, but at the same time has wide global applications. Every single person on earth deserves a life of dignity. And yet, we know that today we have over 200 million children who are working rather than going to school. We know that hundreds of millions of people are illiterate and have no access to basic education, and 2/3 of these are women and girls. We know that 300 children are conscripted and forced into armed conflicts. 1.2 million children are trafficked annually and forced into sexual servitude. And so the statistic of all of these horrific human violations go on and on and on. And yet, somehow, we as individuals are supposed to also be a part of the larger global architecture to try and solve these problems. And one unifying framework that recognizes everything that we need to live a dignified life is that of human rights. When we say human rights now, it is understood to have all of those spectrum of rights that the two gentlemen spoke about eloquently. It is also understood that the governments that we live under are accountable, and that every single individuals and organs in society are also responsible for it. And so there's a very comprehensive, very unifying framework that exists, and yet it's not completely understood by the larger society. And so therefore, the Center for Human Rights, such as the one at the University of Iowa and all across the universities in this country, have a very important role to make sure that this concept, this framework, is fully infused into the daily lives of our society, so that we, as individuals, and also collectively, can also work to help build that society where every single individual can live out their dignified life. And so that's where I come from, and that's where I'm going to. So whether it's children, whether it's women, whether it's torture, whether it's refugees, education, immigration, environment, all of these are part and parcel of the larger human rights struggle that we have to fight for. And I've been engaged in all of these different kinds of issues, thankfully, for the last 15 years.
Mm-hmm. And in California now, what are your particular projects there?
I actually am trying to find a balance right now because I'm a new mom. I have a 3.5-year-old now. And so dedicating 14, 16 hours of my everyday life is a little bit hard. So I've sort of stepped back just a tiny bit, and I'm now doing consulting work. And I continue to do a lot of the public education and workshops and training around human rights, around children, around the Cambodian genocide. And then I also wear another hat as a consultant for philanthropy. So basically individuals who have resources and at the same time want to support the building of a dignified world. And so the philanthropic consulting work revolves around a lot of different issues: human rights defenders, women's rights and empowerment, grassroots organizing, peace in the Middle East, and also sustainable development and agriculture. So the list goes on and on. But still, in all of these projects that I'm engaged in, the training that I've had in human rights comes back, and it's very central to how I conduct my life on a daily basis. It continues to be a very, very rich life.
And when you are talking to young people, say, I know you've done a lot of work with K through 12 students, many projects over the years. Do you see a certain light come into the eyes of the students when they begin to learn about human rights and work on their own projects?
I tell you, one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had, and there's been many, but this one beats them all. When I have a chance to speak with young students, as young as 5th graders, all the way to high school, and to get them to engage in the process of solving global problems. And we did this in Iowa City, and we also met up with other people globally as well. There's this amazing transformation that takes place in young students when they learn about problems, whether it's global child labor or refugees or discriminations against certain groups of people. And then they learn that they can become a part of the problem solving. Something happens. And when we as adults empower them with the capacity to act and to make a difference, You see this transformation up here, in here, and then they get together, and then they basically say, okay, how can we try to fix this problem? And so in the case of Iowa City, a number of fifth graders came together, and you've met some of them, and some of you in the audience have met them as well. They basically learned about global child labor, and then they said, you know what, this is unacceptable, let's do something about it. So they formed a club, and then they raised money, and then they also educated each other, and then they ended up educating the communities. And so the transformation that takes place in a person's heart and mind is never to be underestimated. And then the capacity to take that transformation forward and to make a difference once they learned the possibilities is just absolutely amazing. And a light switch goes off. And then they become changed forever. And then, like Michael Ratner, become change agents that transform our world.
And like Chivisak. So, well, thank you. It's great to have you back here. And I'm going to go down to the end of the row here and talk to Kate Karachai for just a minute. And Kate, you're an Iowa City girl, right? You grew up here in Iowa?
Mostly. I graduated from West. Yeah.
From West High, right.
Close.
So you have done some amazing things as a graduate student. You're now a graduate student in international studies, international
education.
International education. And I know that you came to college thinking you would be studying history and whatnot, but felt that maybe didn't offer you the next step, that you needed to know what came beyond just studying ancient civilization. But somewhere along the way, you began to work for the Center for Human Rights and do some research on human trafficking, and you took on a whole new cause.
Yeah, it kind of took off.
Yeah.
I was put in touch with Alex Roscove in Des Moines, who was working on the trafficking bill for the state of Iowa. This was back in 2006, and this was his second time trying to get the bill implemented. This time, the Department of Justice was really emphasizing that states have their own laws, even though the federal government has a great law. So we got in touch and started working together on how we could get this new bill put through. And Alex was really great in that he, like myself, was very passionate about not just having penalties in there, but also protections for victims. And we lobbied so hard. We talked to politicians, we talked to state troopers, we talked to just about anyone who would listen about this, who we thought might influence the actual passage of the bill when it came through the Senate and the House over in Des Moines. And as it turned out, it was rather a slam dunk. And when we watched it pass through on the Senate floor, it was 55-0. And Alex and I were just kind of up in the top, just like, yeah, that was easy. So we do have a great law now in Iowa that's actually been used. We did have a trafficking case last year. And I have to say I'm really proud of the law here in Iowa. No offense to Missouri and Nebraska, but I think comparatively to some of the states around here, it's a very good law. There's not all the victim protections that we wanted to see in it, but there are some good resources in there for people that have found themselves caught up in this, and there's also some much stiffer penalties and ways for law enforcement to work on this problem here.
Well, next month's program is going to have a significant segment on human trafficking, and we'll be inviting, I think it's Denise Timmons, who prosecuted one of these first cases in human trafficking here in Iowa. But can you tell us very briefly, what would be a sample case for human trafficking that would get prosecuted here in Iowa?
Well, it seems to be, people would often think, oh, this is agricultural. And it doesn't seem to be the case, that most of them, the two that we know of so far, one was prosecuted at the federal level, another at the state level, both involved underage girls that would be considered at risk. One was a runaway, and the other was actually kidnapped, but I believe when she was taken from Minnesota that she was not with her family at the time, or there were some problems going on, and they brought to Iowa and got involved with some men that got them involved in this sort of work. One of the girls was actually out in Cosgrove, just actually prostituting, and the other two girls in the state case, they were doing some dancing here in Iowa, then were taken out to D.C. to do some harder work. And they were eventually apprehended and brought back, and the case was prosecuted successfully with the new state law. So the cases here so far that we've seen tend to be American citizens. Trafficking doesn't necessarily have to be over a state, an international border, and with underage people thus far, although there have been some issues with some other situations going on with some meatpacking facilities and some restaurants around the state, but so far there have been no formal prosecutions of those yet.
Mm-hmm. What was it about human trafficking that was especially compelling to you?
I kind of slid into it. I was working with Amy on looking at some immigration trends in the United States and in Iowa, and I just kept seeing this come up again and again, and started pursuing it a little more in depth, did a lot of research on it, went over to Turkey and did a lot of research on it in Turkey, looking at what was going on there, which is a completely different ballgame, and just really got familiar with the subject, and it's really kind of taken off in the past 10 years as a major topic in human rights, and I believe a lot of it really boils down to there's a huge demand for cheap labor and goods, and there's a lot of people out there willing to serve that. And if you're going to have effective policies against human trafficking, you need to look at both of those: the vulnerability of people, what gets them into a position where they could be trafficked, and also the demand that fuels that. There's always going to be people out there willing to traffic someone if there's that demand. So effective policy needs to look at both of those.
Mm-hmm. Well, it would be good for us to mention, I think, that you were a recipient of a Stanley Fellowship for Research Abroad,
yes,
and also the Philip G. Hubbard Human Rights Award, which is given to the student who's made the most outstanding contribution to the advancement of human rights. So congratulations for that, and good hard work.
Thank you.
And Amy Weissman, let's talk to you just a little bit. You are the current Deputy Director of the Center for Human Rights here at the university, and you've been here how many years now?
About 4.5, actually, almost 5 years. Wow, time goes quickly. Yeah.
Almost 5 years. We were afraid we might not have her with us tonight. As you can tell, she's ready to deliver a baby any day now.
Yep.
And so a very busy week and a wonderful celebration for these 10 years. But
yes,
your background is also incredible. You worked in The Hague at the International Criminal Court, and you worked on editing the final document that came from a women's group that was looking at the military sexual slavery in the World War II, sexual slavery on the part of Japan. Tell us a little bit about some of the cases you've worked on, some of the things that meant the most to you in your work in human rights.
Sure, and of course it's wonderful to be surrounded by these very inspiring women who have amazing stories to tell. Well, I actually worked as an intern for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia when I graduated from law school. I'm an alum of the University of Iowa College of Law. I sort of fell into that opportunity as a result of work that I had done prior to law school, working in refugee resettlement here in Iowa, which created in me a great passion for trying to understand a bit better how people become refugees, what this experience was about, and also what the international legal framework set in motion that in fact controlled a lot of the opportunities and choices that people in those circumstances have. So I spent some time in the former Yugoslavia during the war there, working in refugee camps, which is actually where I met my husband, and led to great transformational experiences for me and set my course as well. When I came back to Iowa, it happened to be the case that there were a lot of people from the former Yugoslavia coming into Iowa and being resettled in Iowa, and having had developed some language skills there, found opportunities working in the resettlement field and learned a great deal about that transition experience and integration experience as a result. So I went to law school with these experiences, and found myself looking for an opportunity to return to that part of the world. It happened to be the case that the tribunal was seeking out students to assist with their work, and I applied at the encouragement of my husband, who thought it would be a wonderful coming full circle of our experiences for me to return to that part of the world, and also to be involved with the prosecution of war crimes from that conflict. So I had an opportunity indeed to do that, luckily, and found myself surrounded by young professionals in the legal field from all over the world with very different understandings and perspectives about the work of a court, such as the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which is one of the special tribunals that were referred to earlier, established by the UN in 1993 to prosecute war crimes during the war in the former Yugoslavia. And was educated, had another law school experience as a result of spending time there and getting to know the law and perspectives of the legal systems very different than my own, and as well as understanding better the prospects and limitations of international criminal prosecutions in a setting such as the court. I actually just had a video conference with some of my students this morning with members of the prosecution team that's working on the Karadzic case. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but the court had a very important development when they brought to justice Radovan Karadzic, who is one of the outstanding fugitives left to be prosecuted from the conflict. And they're reflecting now on all that they learned through this past 15 years of development as a court. You really did feel as though you had history at your back while you were there. In fact, Patricia Wald, who was a judge at the time that I was there, and one of the United States' most prominent appointees to that particular tribunal, made a statement to that effect, that you do feel a great responsibility as well as a great enthusiastic euphoria about the opportunity to be present in the making of this new body of law called international criminal law. So it was an amazing opportunity for a young lawyer, and certainly one that I treasure and have learned a great deal from ongoing. So that was a very, very important experience. While I was there, I had an opportunity, as luck would have it, to work with a couple of non-governmental organizations that were setting up a independent tribunal to provide some modicum of justice for women who were known in popular literature as the comfort women, primarily Korean women, but actually women from all over Asia who were captured by the Japanese military during World War II and utilized as sexual slaves. And for 50 plus years, women who survived that experience had been clamoring for some recognition of that particular crime as a crime under international law, and with very little effect, I must say. And so women's organizations around the world decided to take up this cause and to develop a body of evidence, to present it publicly, to render a judgment, and to say to the world, yes, what was done was wrong. And I was lucky enough to be present at the moment when they were finalizing that drafting judgment process. They had some very prominent jurists involved, which brought attention to the undertaking. It was known as a People's Tribunal. And then actually present when the judgment was rendered, and there were women who had traveled around the world to be present at that judgment, who had themselves experienced sexual slavery, who rose up, some of them in frail health at this point in their lives, and with great strength and actually with fists pounding, walked up on the stage to collect this judgment. It was an example of the value of legal process to recognize it and bring some sense of closure and justice to individuals. Regardless of the formal circumstances of the case. It certainly meant that to these women, and that was a very important experience.
Well, the center received some good news just a couple of months ago, I guess. You received a grant, an award from the State Department regarding immigrant rights. I wonder if you can share with us what that project will be about.
Sure. This is a grant that is in large part about promoting the civil and political rights of foreign-born workers in our state. But it also relates very directly to economic, social, and cultural rights, to the relationship of our labor markets to our immigration policies, for example. This particular grant from the Department of Justice is specifically to educate new immigrants who are workers in the meatpacking and construction industries here in Iowa and their employers about the non-discrimination provisions of immigration law. These are actually, there is actually non-discrimination provisions in immigration law, and that comes as some surprise to a lot of people, which is why the Department of Justice, I think, wants to get the word out there that, in fact, you don't have to, you don't conform to immigration law by discriminating against people on the basis of their immigration status, national origin, or citizenship status, and that's really the heart of the matter. A great deal of confusion and fear on the part of both immigrants and employers about what to do. So we're looking forward, that is the center, the UI Labor Center, and a nonprofit called Nebraska Appleseed out of Omaha, Lincoln area, to developing formal education campaigns to raise awareness amongst immigrant communities as well as with employers in this area about their rights and responsibilities under immigration law.
That's fantastic. It's great. So much more we could be saying. I'm sure we could be here all night, but wonderful to know that this next generation of human rights lawyers and advocates is with us and so bright and with such vision. So thank you, Chivi Sock, Amy Weissman, and Kate Karachai for being with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
As we transition our guests here, some of you may not know that International Programs offers an International Studies major in collaboration with College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and also an International Studies master's program in collaboration with the Graduate College. And Kate is certainly an example of that effort. Once again, you're listening to World Ways from International Programs at the University of Iowa. As part of our World Reach initiative, we will be launching another new public program in February called Prairie Views, and we'll be bringing you more information about it over the next few weeks. To learn more about Prairie Views and other opportunities to engage on international issues such as the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council and Civic, please visit international.uiowa.edu. And so happy now to have our next guests here. We're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to talk about something that happened more than 100 years ago. And we're going to be talking about the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, World Exposition, and one portion of it, which was the Philippine Reservation. And joining me here on stage are Dr. Ramon Lim, a neurologist at the University of Iowa, a retired professor. Very grateful to have you here. He is a Filipino and has lived for many, many years in the States. He's also, some may not know this, but you're also an award-winning artist, an abstract painter. You also have won awards for your beautiful calligraphy. And so it's a pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Lim. And Pam White is with us. She is the director of the Pentecrest Museums and the University of Iowa Museum of Art. Thank you, Pam. And joining us at the end, Catherine Mormond. And you kind of keep this whole boat floating here at the old Capitol, don't you, Catherine? I don't know what your official title is, but you are an assistant director of the museum. So lovely to have you here.
Oh, I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator.
Education Outreach. Yeah. Thank you. And we're all going to talk about different sections of this 1904 Philippine Reservation discussion. But the first thing I want to tell everyone here is before you leave tonight or on another occasion, please visit the lowest level museum space here in the old Capitol and take a look at the display that has been put together there. It's very, very moving. And you see motion motion pictures, also still photographs of what we're going to be talking about tonight, the Philippine Reservation. And in one of the display rooms, you'll also see some of the artifacts that were made by the Filipinos who lived for a year in St. Louis in this Philippine Reservation, and were gathered, as Pam will tell us, by the director of the Museum of Natural History here at the University of Iowa 100 years ago, and exist now on this campus. So some are on display just now. I think what I first want to do is read a little bit of a description of what the Philippine Reservation looked like to this gentleman, Mr. Sequoia Ade, minister. This is his description of what the Philippine Reservation was. He says, to further illustrate the indignities heaped upon the Philippine people following their eventual loss to the Americans, the United States made the Philippine campaign the center point of the 1904 World's Fair held that year in St. Louis. In what was enthusiastically termed a parade of evolutionary progress, visitors could inspect the, quote, primitives that represented the counterbalance to civilization, justifying Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. Pygmies from New Guinea and Africa, who were later displayed in the primate section of the Bronx Zoo, were paraded next to American Indians such as Apache warrior Geronimo, who sold his autograph. But the main draw was the Philippine exhibit, complete with full-size replicas of indigenous living quarters erected to exhibit the inherent backwardness of the Philippine people. The purpose was to highlight both the civilizing influence of American rule and the economic potential of the island chain's natural resources on the heels of the Philippine-American War. It was reportedly the largest specific Aboriginal exhibit displayed in the exposition. As one pleased visitor commented, the Human Zoo exhibit displayed the race narrative of odd peoples who mark time while the world advances, and of savages made by American methods into civilized workers. So I turn to you, Dr. Lim, and ask you to comment a little bit on what you know of the Philippine Reservation.
I was born in the Philippines, and I lived the first 25 years there. So I know about the country a little more than most of you, I think. When I first visited the exhibit, when it first opened, I was struck by the picture they tried to portray. They portray a group of uncivilized, barbaric people, and far from civilization. And I wonder why they did it that way. See, if I had known anything about the country, I would have thought that that was a place that I didn't want to go. Mm-hmm. So it's so long ago, more than 100 years ago, I can only formulate a theory about what was the motivation for those people to do it that way. And first, I'd like to talk about the picture from the American standpoint. In 1898, that was the year of Spanish-American War, and the conflict was really in Cuba. And why did America wanted to do something there so far away? And it doesn't threaten our security here or anything. And the reason is that it's for economic and military purposes. At the end of the 19th century, most European powers they all own a piece of colony in the East, in Asia. America was the only country that did not have any. But at the time, America was militarily getting stronger and stronger. And there was a group of people who wanted to have a military presence in Asia. And why not grab this chance from the Spaniards? So, but there was a big debate between two factions in the Congress. See, the Hawks, represented by Henry Cabot Lodge, and the Doves were represented by Andrew Carnegie. And there was also a anti-imperialist group that Mark Twain also belonged to, and the famous psychologist William James, and they were all outspoken people against it. So, but the Hawks won the day. So America acquired the Philippines, annexed it. First, they tried to find an excuse. They asked Commodore Dewey. See, American fleet was stationed in Hong Kong, and they asked Commodore Dewey to fight the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, and within 6 hours, all the Spanish ships were sunk. There was no match. And the next step was for American to land in the Philippines and to find an excuse. But in fact, at that time, there was already a revolution going on, and the Spanish regime was on the verge of collapse. And America, under the pretext of helping the Filipinos, landed in the land. But secretly, there was a treaty in Paris between the two countries. America gave $20 million to Spain, kind of a purchase. American purchased Philippines for $20 million, and the Spaniards had no choice. They were on the verge of being driven out, so why not take the money and run? So the deal was made unbeknown to the Filipinos. Yeah. The natives didn't know that the business was done, and they thought Americans were coming to help them. But once they came, the American soldiers staged a fake war with the Spanish, and the Spanish just retreated. So they very easily occupied the country, and once they succeeded, they refused to leave, and the Filipino revolutionaries were very, very disappointed. They fought for 2 years, and they already declared independence. They promulgated their own constitution, and they have a Congress, and it's already a nation. And the Americans went there and just wipe it out with force. They were ordered to take over the country by force, and they killed a lot of Filipinos. The war lasted 2 years, from 1898 to 1999 to 1901. And at the end of the war, American lost 4,000 soldiers, and the Filipinos lost 20,000 soldiers, and also 200 civilians were killed. And there were at least one instance of atrocity where an American soldier was killed, and then the lieutenant or captain ordered to massacre all the male members of the village, including children. And all those things happened. And the Filipinos were very disappointed. It was a very brutal war for 2 years. See, we talk about the Vietnam War, but that was a forerunner of the same kind of war, the same nature. See, where a war was fought far away from American homeland without, for reasons not connected to any threat to our security here. And it's all for the sake of colonization, for economic and political, military advantages. See, America went to the Philippines for the same reason that 300 years ago the Spaniards went to the Philippines. They went there because they had an eye on China. See, China was a big nation with great resources, and they used the Philippines as a stepping stone. See, when the Spaniards colonized the Philippines, there was a trade. It's called Manila Galleon. The commercial ship went between Manila and Acapulco in Mexico. And what was the cargo? They shipped porcelain and silk from China to Manila, to Acapulco, and then to Spain. And in return, they shipped all the silvers produced in South America to Manila and to China. So that was the trade. And the Spaniards profited from there. Now, America took the place of Spain, also with an eye on China. So they want to have trade advantage, and also military presence there too. So at the end, after 2 years of brutal war, the insurgents were subdued. And that started the American rule. Mm-hmm. So the Americans weren't that all bad. We have to be fair because they try to repair their damage by helping the country. They started some democracy in the Philippines. They give them gradual independence, and at the same time, Americans popularized education. See? So during Spaniard rule, the education was not emphasized at all. And so the Philippines now it has a high rate of literacy. Mm-hmm. So those are the good things that the Americans did to the Philippines. But that part of the dark age, the 2 years of brutal war, that was put into the dark corner of history. So when we were small, nobody talked about it. We didn't even know about it. It was later on that I knew, read history, get into the internet, and we found all those things.
But that's a good preface to help us understand why in 1904 certain powers that be would have wanted to create a very positive
Going back
image.
To my theory is that that exposition tried to portray Philippines as a non-civilized savage in order to justify our colonizing it, our ruling it.
Pam, let me ask you something about the collection that we have here and what you know of the earlier museum directors' interest in those artifacts and the fact that so many of them reside here.
Well, I think that the collection that we have and the whole collection and the issue raises an issue that all of us in museums confront, and that is that we can't go back and whitewash the past into something that we wish it would be or make it different. But the one thing that I can say, I think with a great deal of pride, is that since these objects came into our collection in 1905, the museum has cared for them with great care, and we felt that in honor of our 150th anniversary, that this exhibition would be especially appropriate to bring up not only these issues that we're talking about today, the wrongs, but also to celebrate the beauty of these objects just in and of themselves and to give them some dignity. We have a number of objects that came to us because Charles Nutting, who was one of the early directors and founders of our museum, in fact, the very room that you are in was the first place in 1858 that the Natural History Museum of the University of Iowa existed, right here. And we are the second oldest museum west of the Mississippi. Now that is a very distinguished heritage. We have a book coming out later this year. Now we have over 120,000 objects of all kinds, amazing things. Charles Nutting found out that they were dispersing the objects that were made by the Filipino people. The Smithsonian got the greater lot of them. The Philadelphia Museum of Commercial Industry got them. It's now at the University of Penn. And we got a great score of them. I'm not sure that we understood the import of these objects until a researcher came forward a few years ago and started working on them with Shala Wilson, who was supposed to be with us tonight except for illness. And she got some calls. We decided that even though this would be very controversial in a way, that was our mission. When we reformed and opened Old Capitol in May of 2006, under the guidance of Sandy Boyd, we dedicated ourselves to become a center for the humanities. And what that means is that sometimes we have to address some difficult issues, that we have to bring to light some issues, just like we are now, that are uncomfortable to talk about. We would never dream of putting people on view, as they did in the 1904 World's Fair. But do you realize that at the Natural History Museum in New York, there was a person accessioned into the collection? It's appalling to think about it, but that's what happened. The history of museums is not always very pretty. We can go back a number of years. The other thing that we can say is that this is also how people learn. This was the most popular exhibition in the fair. It earned the most money. A number of the people were asked, however willingly, came over. There was a great deal of positive exposure for the company, for the country, and all of the companies that were involved. Of course, the auspices are kind of grim, as we hear and as we know the history now when we do back reading. But we felt it was important to present these objects in a very dignified way with appropriate background material so that you can see what the history is now and also appreciate the artistry that was involved in the making of these objects. It raises our issue of our history of our museum, and it also brings to full center what Old Capitol is all about, bringing the humanities to visual light.
Mm-hmm. Catherine, in your work with education, have you had young people, classrooms coming through to see the exhibit?
Not classrooms necessarily, but we've had quite a few visitors.
Mm-hmm. What's the reaction? What do you hear?
Oh gosh, a lot of them are just astounded by the grandioseness of the fair itself. And one thing that touches me personally is that the people were put on exhibit, and whenever I speak with somebody that has seen the exhibit, it touches their heart as well. And people ask, we've had a few comments, are we the wiser? It's quite eye-opening, and it wasn't that long ago, just, over 100 years ago. That's mm-hmm. not that long. Mm-hmm. So it's very eye-opening for most of the visitors.
Yeah. Any concluding remarks that you might like to make, Ramon? We're about finished with this segment here, but would you like to say anything else?
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention, which is quite interesting. There was a rumor that Andrew Carnegie offered to pay the government $20 million in order to set the country free. Really? But apparently that wasn't taken.
Yeah. Huh. Well, I know that I've learned a lot since I first saw the exhibit downstairs and went back. You can find a lot online that tells you some stories about that fair and so on. And I hope that all of you will have the opportunity to take a look at what is exhibited downstairs. And yeah.
One other thing I wanted to say is that the Pentacrest Museums is very proud to be, I think, one of the first partners of Worldways.
Yes.
And we sponsor this by giving the space at great financial gift. So we're very proud of that. This is part of our mission, and we will do that. And we're very happy to have this program here. And these important discussions really need to happen. And this is a great forum for those.
Thank you. And we are so grateful to be able to be here.
Don't take me wrong. I like to emphasize the positive side, too.
Sure.
It's a good anthropological exhibit. I spent a lot of time looking at it. It was really educational.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But for the general public, in a World Fair kind of exposition, you can give people a distorted impression.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Ramon Lim, Pam White, and Catherine Moorman. Thank you so much. Great. Well, this is Worldways, as you all know, and I'm welcoming our next group of guests. This is our final segment, and one that will have, I know, a very uplifting tone because of the person, the gentleman who is the subject of this segment, Dr. Ignacio Ponseti, who has recently passed away, but lived with us for 95 years and did amazing and wonderful things here at the University of Iowa and around the world. And I would like to introduce the guests who are here with me. Paul Etre, who is with the College of Medicine. You're assistant to the director at the College of Medicine. This is the director. Jody Buckwalter, Dr. Joseph Buckwalter, thank you. And we have John Buchanan as well, who's joined us, a businessman here from Iowa City and a gentleman who spent a lot of time working with Tippie School of Business and young entrepreneurs, now also connected with the Ponseti Foundation or Association. So please welcome these guests. Dr. Buckwalter, I'd like to ask you a little bit first about we're going to be talking a little bit about clubfoot, and I'm not sure that many of us have a very good sense of what this impairment is, how many children are born with it, and a little history there.
Certainly, it's called clubfoot because the foot actually looks very much like a club. The foot is turned in and points downward. It varies considerably in severity, but in many children, if it's not corrected, they are crippled for life, and they are not only unable to run or play or jump, they can't work, they can't go to school, and it's absolutely a devastating, crippling deformity, and it affects children throughout the world, many of them in undeveloped parts of the world. So that's the essence of the deformity. We don't know the cause, and one of Dr. Ponseti's passions was to find the cause, and he kept that passion throughout his life.
Yeah. And traditional treatments for clubfoot have involved what?
Well, actually, many different treatments have been tried, and hundreds of years ago, people tried to just physically wrench the foot back into a normal position. There were various devices. One of them was actually called the Thomas wrench, and it was a device that generated tremendous force on the foot, was applied to the foot, and then wrenched the foot literally back into position. Of course, it did a tremendous amount of damage to the tissues of the foot, the nerves, the blood vessels, the bones. Then surgical procedures became widespread, and many prominent pediatric orthopedic surgeons advocated doing extensive operations to open up these very tiny feet, cut the ligaments that joined the bones together, shove everything back together, and then try to create a foot that was resembled much more closely the normal foot. But Dr. Ponseti's insight and remarkable contribution was looking at the results of surgical treatment, some of it actually here at the University of Iowa, and surgical treatment had started here in the early 1920s with Dr. Steindler. Dr. Ponseti came here in 1941, and he became fascinated by looking up the results of the treatment of many deformities, not the least of which was clubfoot, and saying, my goodness, this just doesn't work very well. And I'm sure that that was one of the driving forces that led him to study the anatomy of the foot, the development of the foot, to spend endless hours, really years of his life, trying to understand how the bones formed, how their shapes changed, how the foot became normally plantigrade, as we say, that is the foot being able to apply to the surface, and then what went wrong in clubfoot, and then developing this fabulous technique, a safe, effective, and relatively easily learned method of restoring normal life to children with this deformity. And of course, at Iowa, with Dr. Ponseti's guidance for me and many others that trained here, we all learned how to do this, and we knew it was the best, but the rest of the world didn't. And throughout, as you alluded to, Joan, throughout pediatric orthopedics, this technique was not highly regarded for decades. And Dr. Ponseti developed it, well, really starting in the 40s and 50s, and had published on it, but it simply wasn't recognized. And in fact, many people thought, well, that only works in Iowa, obviously. It just can't be something that works in California or New York or Europe. But he persevered, and it was really the internet that changed all this. The parents of children who had clubfoot, who'd had very extensive procedures and were not pleased with the results, did their own investigations, and they learned about Dr. Ponseti and the Ponseti technique, and they started talking to each other over the internet. And it just, within a really remarkably short period of time, became a subject that every parent with a child with clubfoot knew about.
Yeah.
And they started coming to Iowa City, and it really was a remarkable event, driven partly by parents and, of course, initiated by Dr. Ponseti.
Well, Paul, let me go to you next. You were a very close friend and worked with Dr. Ponseti, as did Dr. Buchwalder for many, many years. But I know that you have, I can ask you to talk a little bit about his character, his way with children, how he handled an appointment.
Sure. If you don't mind, I just have a few notes here.
Not at all.
They look like lots of pages, but I didn't want to wear glasses, so I wrote bold letters,
No, please.
just like you did.
Please, just like I did.
Okay. To me, Dr. Ponseti was actually a loving father, a caring uncle, a loyal friend, a patient teacher, and an understanding soulmate. Almost every day during the past 20 years, Dr. Ponseti and I had lunch together. We were joined by Dr. Dick Johnston over here in the last 10 years. These were precious times with Dr. Ponseti. Being an avid student of World War II, my lunchtimes with Dr. Ponseti were akin to being in the presence of the prominent personalities of that period. General Franco of Spain, Joseph Stalin of Russia, Winston Churchill of Great Britain, and of course, last but not least, FDR of the US. Dr. Ponseti was in his middle 20s at the start of World War II. He shared with me many stories and details about this historical time. I felt personally privileged and blessed that I was given the opportunity to spend so much time with Dr. Ponseti. This evening now, it was afternoon, but when I came, by the way, I want to commend the audience for the stamina. This afternoon, this evening, I would like to share briefly about Dr. Ponseti's obsession to heal babies and to make their feet whole. Dr. Ponseti's passion and compassion to relieve babies from their pain and deformity defined the essence of his being. This passion compelled him to show up at his clinic every morning until a few weeks ago, at past age 95, when he suffered a massive stroke several weeks ago. Dr. Ponseti often brushed off my advice for him to stay home once in a while and relax. He always told me, I have to treat my babies. A clinic visit with Dr. Ponseti was a memorable and unforgettable experience. I will briefly just describe one. A mother in Denmark discovers that her newborn baby girl was born with a deformed foot. The mother was distraught and frightened. Like Dr. Buckwalter mentioned, she searched the internet, and lo and behold, she saw Dr. Ponseti's name everywhere as the expert in the world in the treatment of club feet. Frantically, she places a long-distance call to Dr. Ponseti's office. To her utter surprise, she finds herself talking in person with the master himself. She is comforted by his assurances and dignified accent. Now, I'll explain later why the accent. He tells the mother, I have seen hundreds of babies with a similar deformity. When can you come to Iowa City? In a couple of days, the mother and her baby appear in Dr. Ponseti's clinic. You must have flown all night, Dr. Ponseti observed. To the visiting doctors, and he always had doctors from foreign countries visit him, and to his staff surrounding him, Dr. Ponseti adds, and he always told me that there is nothing more powerful than a mother's love for her child. The mom appeared extremely nervous and anxious. The baby girl was crying on her shoulder. Dr. Ponseti starts engaging the mother in small talk by asking her which town in Denmark she came from. When she mentions the name of the town, Dr. Ponseti says, what a lovely town. My wife and I hiked over there in 1986 and ate lunch at so-and-so restaurant. Dr. Ponseti takes the crying baby in his arms. He turns around to his music box, and as Mike will help me here, he plays Mozart. And I got the disc here that he always played. It's called the Mozart Effect, Music for Babies, Nighty Night. Mozart music heals, he mutters. Dr. Ponseti places the crying baby on the exam table and starts talking to the baby. He caresses her forehead and starts touching her deformed foot. Suddenly, the baby stops crying. All is heard in the exam room is the mother's sniffing, the baby's cooing, and Mozart's music. Your baby has beautiful eyes, he tells the mother. Turning to the staff, don't you think the baby has her mother's eyes? The mother tears up, and Dr. Ponseti starts to gently manipulate the baby's tender foot. Dr. Buckwalter attests to the fact that no one in the world was more familiar with the anatomy of the foot than Dr. Ponseti. That's because when Dr. Ponseti was a youngster, growing up in the island of Majorca, his father taught him the art of watchmaking, which helped to condition his mind to synchronize many connecting parts, which were both intricate and delicate. So during the examination of the baby's foot, Dr. Ponseti uses the same intense concentration and focus as he did making the watch. His fingers gently feel and manipulate the ligaments and cartilages. All the while, the baby is purring like 7 kittens. Tears continue to roll down the mother's cheeks. Dr. Ponseti becomes totally focused on the baby's foot as if in a trance. At the end of the examination, Dr. Ponseti gently rubs the baby's foot with his fingers. He turns to the mother, anxious and trembling, and says, in a few months and after the application of several casts, your baby's foot will become normal. She will be able to walk, run, jump, dance, and play soccer, just like any other normal baby. The mother leaps from her chair and gives Dr. Ponseti a long embrace. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ponseti, she whispers. This exact scene is replicated day in and day out in the Ponseti Clubfoot Clinic, as mothers and their babies flock to Iowa City from all around the world. Now back to the accent. You know, he lived here for over, 70, 80 years, and he retained that accent. Why did he retain that accent? When Dr. Ponseti fled Spain in 1939 to Mexico, he stayed 2 years there. He was 25 years old and 26 in Mexico. He knew a little English, but he was fluent in Spanish, of course, French, and German. During his 2 years in Mexico, he lived in a village, and he was the only doctor there. And he told me, Paul, I never went out with any girl in Mexico. I don't know if you knew that, Helena. He said every evening after work, I'd come and I'll take the Mexico City Daily paper. He will take the Spanish edition and the English edition. And he will write every word in Spanish and the corresponding word in English. And that was the only way for him to learn English. And he taught himself English. And as Dr. Buckwalter can attest, he was actually flush with all kinds of words and vocabulary. I think I'll stop here.
Okay, well, that was wonderful. That was wonderful. Well, and we'll wrap up with you, John, and you can tell us a little bit about your work. Now, I know that you knew Dr. Ponseti these last few years, and how did you get involved with this project?
I'm a Johnny-come-lately to the passion of Ponseti, and it came about in a rather interesting way because Dr. Ponseti wrote me and said, John, I would like very much to come visit with you about a situation, and I hope you can find the time. Well, Ellen and I returned from Florida, and the next day, I believe that was a Saturday, and the next day, Helena Ponseti and Dr. Ponseti were at our home. From that moment in time, we had met them, of course, socially, and I knew him in that way, but that was it. I'm not in obviously the physician community at all, but knew them as we did socially. He described the situation and asked if I would help, and I said of course I would, and began to learn more and more about Dr. Ponseti and the work that he had been doing, and we gradually resolved the issues and the problems that he had concern about, which happened to be the children's brace that we use after these gnarled little feet turn into these beautiful little feet in about a 3 to 4 week period, which is truly what we come to know as the Ponseti miracle. When that was resolved, I started to peel the onion of looking at, and became, frankly, quite, I don't know whether I want to say outraged, incensed at the basic overall medical community's lack of embracing this incredible, absolutely incredible, inexpensive, simple, and effective way to deal with children born with clubfoot. And the more I started to know about it, the madder I got. And my passion grew out of the fact that this could not stand, it could not reside primarily as an Iowa product, and became very, very emboldened about the fact that this needed to really be broadly advocated around the world. The irony was, of all of this, that because the Ponseti method is not only so effective, it is so, we can actually train other than MDs in the developing countries, which is where 80% of obviously all of the clubfoot resides. Their surgery has never been considered because it was far too expensive. Not only that is, there was a lack of a number of physicians. If you take the typical African countryside where there's maybe 100 or 20 or 25, 30 million people in a country, and there's only one orthopedic surgeon, it's almost virtually an inappropriate use of that person's resources that to take him out of the surgical operating room where he's doing the things that only he can do. But in Dr. Ponseti's point about this was the fact that we could train non-MDs, train midwives, physiotherapists, medical officers as they're referred to in Africa, and they could be trained to do the Ponseti method. And because it involves inexpensive plaster cast, which is something that was available to them, we did not need a surgical setting. Obviously, this is a non-surgical procedure. It can be performed here again without antibiotics and all the other expensive things that surgery would involve, and thus was never available to those families to be able to afford a surgical procedure. But the Ponseti method, as we say, for the basic fundamental costs of less than $100, we can change a child's life forever. Other than that, we talk about human rights, and I think it's really appropriate that, Joan, we are here on a night of human rights because we believe that, and I believe firmly, that this should be a human right, because if you see a child with uncorrected clubfoot, the deprivation, the stigma, the inability they're not running buses around developing countries, their inability to get any kind of schooling, they are outcasts, what they suffer is just the most inhumane and back to no rights at all. The exciting thing for me tonight to listen to our Cambodia story is, interestingly enough, that tonight, as we speak, we have 2 of our team of 3 clubfoot specialists. Dr. Jose Merquende is off teaching in Europe and in Spain. The Ponseti, he has 2 training sessions. Dr. Fred Dietz is in Cambodia and Thailand this week giving Ponseti training sessions. And Dr. Weinstein is usually always speaking somewhere around the world, and Japan today. So we are truly an international outreach forum, but delivering a terribly effective and inexpensive method for treating what is considered, the World Health Organization recognizes clubfoot as the single most disabling musculoskeletal disease, or deformity that the world has. Mm-hmm. And the beautiful part is we do not know what the cause is. The unique thing is that the blessing of Dr. Ponseti is we have the ability to cure it, and cure it inexpensively. And we now want to move his legacy forward in finding out because we could change these demographics substantially by doing the research to find out what is at the origin of it. And that is one of our great challenges that we want to, as the Ponseti International Association, is get to the bottom of that. I might add also that we're working a great deal with Rotary and Rotary programs, developing Ponseti training programs, which is what we want to do, is to go around the world. And we find that Rotary, in its presence of over 33 clubs, or 33,000 clubs, and 1.2 million people, when they come to the end of what they call the eradication of polio, we want to be there, hopefully, as a pilot program to take on the eradication of clubfoot.
Wonderful.
Neglected clubfoot around the world.
Wow. Well, I'm sure we're all just incredibly impressed and touched, not only by the character of this lovely man whose presence we've lost just now, Ignacio Ponseti, but also those of you who carry on his work and who are trying to provide this kind of help all over the world at low cost. We're really very grateful that you would take the time to be here. I know you're all very, very busy, but I also know that you care very much for this man and his work. And so thank you. Please, everyone, thank our guests. Thank you. So that's the end of our program tonight. I want to say thank you very much. Pam White mentioned that we are partnering with the Museum of Art, also with KRUI and with our friends at UITV. Thank you very much for your help, and I want to thank all of my friends and colleagues at International Programs for their support as we got this program off the ground. I do hope that many of you, most of you, will come to upcoming programs. These programs will be on once a month. Thank you very much. Thank you. And so thank you very much. We'll see you next time.